I'm Adam Strabejko, Swiss National Science Foundation researcher and the principal investigator on a project focused on emergence of access and benefit sharing rules for digital sequence information. On the November 1st in 2024 in Cali in Colombia, the Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity adopted a decision establishing the multilateral mechanism for the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of digital sequence information, DSI for short. This decision marks a culmination of long discussions at the CBD to regulate benefit sharing from the digitized information content of genetic resources. In parallel, member states of the World Health Organization are negotiating the so-called Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing Agreement, Benefit Sharing System, PAPS for short, also applicable to sequence information under the Pandemic Agreement. So on the one hand, rapid, reliable, and timely access to sequence information is important for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. So think, for example, of the recent pandemic where rapid access to data allowed for development of vaccines. On the other hand, discussions continue on how to establish benefit sharing under PAPS, which could include monetary or in-kind contributions of health products to address global health inequity. These continue to be some of the most contentious issues under the pandemic agreement negotiations that are currently ongoing. So for these reasons, it is important to ensure that the different systems talk to each other, the systems under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and under the World Health Organization. Our purpose here is to create the discussions between different fora, links between these processes, and create an opportunity for coming to some shared understandings of the issue of digital sequence information regulation. So I'm joined here by wonderful panelists. Charlotte Germain-Aubray, Project Management Officer at the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity, and Kirsty Bryant, Associate Program Management Officer at the Secretariat of the CBD, Dr. Amber Hartmann-Scholz, Head of the Science Policy Department at the Leibniz Institute, DSMZ, the German Collection of Microorganisms and Cell Cultures, Bart van Voren, Partner for Life Sciences and Biodiversity, Access and Benefit Sharing at Covington and Burling LLP, and Dr. Viviana Munoz-Teles, Coordinator of the Health, Intellectual Property, and Biodiversity Program at the South Center. And before we begin, I wanted to mention some housekeeping rules. So we are an academic space, and we encourage honest and constructive debate. And we'll start with a round of presentation from each of the speakers, followed up by moderated Q&A with the audience. And once we're in Q&A, I will ask you to put questions in the chat, and I'll moderate the discussion and redirect your questions to the speakers. Finally, please note that this event is being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to our Global Health Center YouTube channel. And for more information, please pay attention to the chat where members of our team will share some additional materials and information. So without any further ado, let me give the floor to Charlotte Germain-Aubray and Kirsty Bryant, who will present the CBD COP decision. Charlotte and Kirsty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam, for the lovely introduction. Charlotte and I are here to present the DSI decision to you, as you can see on the screen now. I just want to take a moment to thank you for inviting us here to speak today. We really welcome this kind of collaboration and opportunity to foster discussion relating here. We have a lot of slides to present. I'm going to whiz through them, but the intention, as Adam said, is for these to be available afterwards, and so you can read into them at your own pace. And so with that introduction, I just wanted to take a quick moment to recap what the Convention on Biological Diversity objectives are. So 3 main objectives, and most relevant for this discussion is the third objective, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. And relevant for this is the Nagoya Protocol, which is a supplementary agreement to the CBD and provides a legal framework for the implementation of this objective, noting that this only covers physical genetic resources, which is where we have the conversation on DSI. And I use the term DSI, but I understand in the the WHO context, genetic sequence data is used, so GSD. Here in the CBD, we use DSI, but they're not necessarily equivalent things, but equivalent in terms of the respective negotiations. So on screen here, you'll see a quick recap of the COP negotiations to date. DSI actually only emerged within our negotiations back in 2016. And then since 2018, COP14, we've had a wealth discussions, and most notably intersessional work on DSI. This resulting to 2024, where we had the COP16 decision, which Charlotte will take you through shortly. I just wanted to pause and take a moment to look at decision 15.9. So this was quite a monumental decision for DSI. And paragraphs 9 and 10 of decision 15.9 are probably the most relevant for discussion here. So that set out a framework for what a solution on DSI and what will become the multilateral mechanism should cover. And you'll see under paragraph H, we have been mutually supportive of other access and benefit sharing arrangements. Paragraph 10 covers monetary and non-monetary benefit sharing and brings in aspects of people and local communities. Once again, apologies for whizzing through the slides, but I know we're limited for time here and we've got some great speakers. We then move on to the road to COP16. So COP15 also set out a wealth intersessional work. We had 2 intersessional negotiations, open-ended working groups. We had a wealth of study and 14 advisory group informal meetings. This allowed us and participants, parties, stakeholders to really continue DSI and pave the way and build the foundations for COP16 itself. With that in mind, I will hand over to Charlotte now, I believe, to go through decision 16.2. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Kirsty, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It's our pleasure and honor to be here. We're very happy you invited us, and we welcome these types of collaborations. So I'll jump into the decision 16/2, which came out of the Cali meeting in October of last year, so very recent. So that decision basically adopts the modalities for the operationalization of the multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of DSI, and that includes a global fund, which is now known as the Cali Fund because it was in Cali. And so from now on, when you hear Cali Fund, this is what we're talking about, the Cali Fund on DSI. There's a further work process. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, obviously, as always. But the modalities themselves are in the annex to the decision. So when you go through the decision, go straight to the annex. That's what you want to hear, how the mechanism is going to work. So paragraph 1 is basically the scope of the DSI under the mechanism. So which DSI are we talking about? And this is the DSI that's available publicly. And that is not subject to mutually agreed terms that might have been established under, for example, the Nagoya Protocol, but there's other arrangements as well that could include DSI, unless, of course, those arrangements make it possible to share the DSI publicly. Also, the DSI should not be under another international instrument on access and benefit sharing, unless, of course, this instrument chooses the multilateral mechanism and or the Cali Fund for their implementation. Next, please. So these modalities say that everybody should share monetary benefits if and so paragraph 3, and everybody who uses DSI should share non-monetary benefits in one way or another. So in terms of monetary benefits, we're talking about very large companies, entities that reach high levels of assets, sales, and benefits, and average proceedings over 3 years, and should share a certain percentage of their profit or their revenue. These companies are from certain sectors. So we have here a list of sectors, and this list is under review and is without prejudice to DSI covered by other instruments, of course. Next, please. In paragraph 5, we have the modalities. So who is not expected to pay into the Cali Fund? So we have obviously those companies that might be in those sectors but do not use directly or indirectly DSI, so don't rely on DSI for their activities and their commercialization. Also, public databases, public research, academic institution, all these are not expected to contribute to the Cali Fund. Everybody is welcome and encouraged to contribute, of course. This is a benefit sharing fund, but they're not expected to. Non-monetary benefits, as I said, everybody's expected to share them, and we're trying to align them as much as possible with existing initiatives within the Secretariat or in other places, not trying to reinvent the wheel on that very, very large topic. Next, please. How will contribution to the Cali Fund works? So we have parties should take administrative, policy, or legislative measures to incentivize users to participate and contribute to the Cali Fund. Non-parties are invited to do the same. Contributions to the Cali Fund can be made directly by companies, but can also be arranged through national authorities, depending on the government, basically. When a company contributes to the Cali Fund, they receive a receipt, right? Everything is very transparent, very public. We'll know who gave how much at what point, etc. But when companies actually reach the monetary contributions that are expected from the decision, they receive a certificate. The certificate says that they are considered to having fairly and equitably shared monetary benefits from the use of DSI under this mechanism. And this certificate excludes them from the expectation to further share any other monetary benefits from the use of the same information for that year. And this is an annual thing. Next, please. So the funds, how will we use the fund? So the Cali Fund is under the CBD. The funds should be allocated to either governments from a developing country, or at least half of those funds will go to Indigenous people and local communities, as they are recognized as guardians of biodiversity and disproportionately contribute to the conservation of that biodiversity. It's a big point in this multilateral mechanism. They have to spend it in line with the global biodiversity framework, in line with their own strategies. Indigenous people and local communities have to spend it on their self-identified needs for the purpose of conservation. And a steering committee, we'll see the governance, can also decide to allocate some of the money to capacity building activities specifically. Next, please. So the governance, the fund is administered by the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office, as decided in the decision, and this fund will be open in the coming weeks. And there will be a steering committee that will support this fund, and a secretariat that will support the steering committee and make sure that the mechanism functions according to the decision. Paragraph 10 to 12 are on database governance. There's an encouragement and invitation for database hosts to make as much information publicly available on the multilateral mechanism, on the requirements at the national, international level, to provide information on the country of origin, and to basically implement 16/2 and give information on that. Next, please. Thank you. So this is the text of paragraphs 10 to 12, and I'm not going to actually sit on it because my colleague Amber, I think, is going to go a lot more in depth with it. Next. But finally, the relationship to other instruments. So the mechanism has to be mutually supportive and adaptive to, other international instruments. And basically the goal here is really to avoid any stacking of obligation. We don't want to have a situation where companies, in good faith contribute to one instrument, and then another is going to come and ask them for more money for the use of the same data for the same purpose. That would be really detrimental to everybody, basically. So there's a lot of work on collaboration and on streamlining, and events like today are an illustrations that we are trying, and everybody is trying to collaborate as much as possible, informing each other. And next, please. We hope that this continues in the future. we're very thankful for it. Here we have some notifications. 4 of them came out on December 10th. We're asking for collaboration. We're forming the steering committee. We have an expert group that has some work to do, and we have several invitations to submit views on various aspects of this model. I really invite you to read through those notifications and consider putting out a nomination or submitting your views. The more views we have, the wider the information comes from, the better the work will be, and the better the collaboration will be with other instruments. So this is something I really invite you to, and I'm asking the organizers to share these slides so you can look at this information in a quiet time afterwards, and you can just click on those notifications and actually have a look at them. With this, thank you very much for inviting us. We're happy to take any questions when the time comes.
Thank you very much, Charlotte and Kirsty. Very helpful presentation, especially for those of us who are in Geneva or focused more on the WHO side of things. I think it will be very important to have that in mind. And about the slides, please, for the participants, please pay attention to the chat where members of our team will inform you about the follow-ups to receive materials from this meeting. And as I mentioned, the meeting is being also recorded, so you will have access to the information. And now, as Charlotte mentioned, the CBD decision refers to databases and entities operating databases. And for that reason, I'm very happy to give the floor to Dr. Amber Hartman-Schultz, who will speak about the scientific lessons learned on DSI from the CBD decision 16.2. Amber, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. And thanks again for this invitation. It really is inspiring, and I hope this is useful for the different people listening in today. So I had sort of 3 kind of buckets of topics that from a scientific perspective might be useful to interpret or to see the CBD decision 16.2 through. And the first one is really the paragraph that Charlotte just alluded to, which is the new rules for DSI databases, DSI data governance. And that's found in paragraph 10, and it's a pretty long paragraph, actually. So to avoid having to read through carefully negotiated text, I'm going to try to summarize it here, and apologies that any consolidation might lead to a lack of clarity. But the paragraph basically says, databases need to inform users of the new multilateral mechanism, and that commercial use of public DSI could mean you have to pay. I mean, it says a lot more than that, but that's the assent. And a second informational piece that databases need to pass on is that there is existing international and national laws in many cases, both under the Nagoya Protocol and under the CBD in general, as well as other ABS instruments. So do access and benefit sharing. And then the third criteria is to require that the country of origin, or in the case of other instruments, for example, the high seas, provenance information, the location of where the original sample came from, is provided in the database, as well as associated traditional knowledge. And apologies for all the acronyms, I'm trying to keep the text short. Then the fourth requirement is that the databases should be consistent with open access to data, and also consider a number of acronyms that represent various data constructs, data principles, the FAIR, the CARE, and the trust principles, as well as the UNESCO open science recommendations. The final one is that DSI submitters, so those that have generated sequence data and are uploading them into a database, must confirm that DSI, those data, are not subject to any restrictions that prohibit the sharing of that data. For example, because that data was obtained under a Nagoya Protocol legislation that says you can't share this data. And how do we end up with those rules around DSI? Why didn't we end up with a closed database where all CBD newly generated sequences might have ended up here? And the reason for that is this sort of cartoon here of yellow, green, and purple circles. So the DSI Scientific Network, with support from NORAD, put together a policy brief on the database landscape. Within the network, we have all the heads of the INSTC databases, as well as the heads of IBEL and the Chinese database. And if you kind of think about, in particular, DNA and RNA data, there's a core repository. Those are these these purple and the light pink is the Chinese one that has begun to sync with these other large genetic databases. Those in and of themselves, though, aren't enough. Those are basically like the core data hubs, if you will. But when you have a scientific question, it's such a huge amount of data and not really sliced with your specific scientific question that there's a yellow database that has decided I will take a part of those purple databases and I will present that data in a way that is useful for a specific subfield of genetics. So it might be, for example, a worm database. It could be a pathogen database. It could be a database on the structure of chlorophyll or enzymes in general. And there's various levels of specialty and various levels of scientific angles, if you will. Then the green databases are those databases that are private, often held or hosted by industry, by for-profit entities that pull data out of the public sphere, integrate it with their own privately generated data, and begin to integrate it. And in fact, that is the place really here in the CBD that negotiators were trying to make sure, how do we ensure that that kind of use falls into an obligation to share monetary benefits? That interconnectivity might seem kind of crazy because those circles, that wasn't even 3,000 circles. And so this has, unfortunately, a lot of text, and it is trying to represent in a scientifically accurate way the simpler circles on the left to go from experimental data to archival data to knowledge bases. So this little cartoon here, which I invite you to scan the QR code, or I'm also happy to share the text, helps us to understand how can I go from sequence data, for example, a gene in a bacterial genome, and then I want to look up specific kinds of, let's say, antibiotic properties. And then I really want to understand the protein structures of those enzyme properties. So I have to move from one database to the next. And as you can see here, this little cartoon, as it goes around, touches 12 different databases to answer different kinds of scientific questions. And that's just one little bacteria with one little set of antibiotic enzymes. And that across all of the life sciences is why we have 3,000 interconnected databases. And those data transformation, that sharing of data across the ecosystem, is why paragraph 10 really tried to look for globally implementable approaches to DSI governance rather than to try to close up, lock off, or to silo data. Why is this important? This is also important because scientists around the world use their data, their locally generated data, more than foreign DSI. So a study that we had done with a number of colleagues around the world really looked at the reuse patterns of DSI, of genetic data, in publications. And if you look at where that data came from, that is to say where the original biological sample came from, if you're looking here at the African group, the column to the left, the biggest users of African data is actually African located scientists. And so if you start to lock down and silo data into different buckets or into different local databases, then you might inherently sort of impact your own local scientists the most, their ability to do this. Every column has users from every region and vice versa. The other thing that this data teaches us, and the reason that these data need to stay open and interconnected, is because of the DSI capacity gap. You can see for the 3 lowest resourced UN regions here that the amount of publications coming out of them is also where the DSI capacity gap, the output gap, is the biggest. The second biggest take-home message from the CBD decision for me is I think of the John Donne poem, No Man is an Island, and I think you can say no sequence is an island, no single sequence record is an island. And what I mean by that is if you look at, for example, a commercial outcome like a patent, you might ask yourself what kind of sequence data would be listed, referenced in that patent. You might ask yourself, is the pandemic causing pathogens, so in this case SARS-CoV-2, listed? Are there other PABs DSI that are listed? Are there non-PABs DSI? And how much DSI total? And I'm happy to talk in the discussion about what those buckets are that we've created here. And what I'd like to do for the next 2 slides is to walk you through a case study that we did on Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine, which was filed before there was actually a pandemic declared, which is a patent on the method to generate an mRNA vaccine. And what you can see inside this patent is no mention at all of the pandemic causing organism, even though it's clear that Moderna did have access to that. There are over 250 sequences that Moderna explained to the patent examiners that they had to use in order to reference and in order to develop this method. There are some that are PABS-like, like the beta coronaviruses, for example, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome or SARS-CoV, not one, but the one that came before CoV-2, CBD-like DSI, such as parainfluenza, metapneumovirus, or measles. The countries of origin of some of those sequences are also very geographically diverse. And there's also a lot of artificial sequences, so examples of where we know that sequence data was used, but then it was altered. And all of this was made public through the patent process defined under WIPO into the INSDC DSI databases. Why did they use all of that stuff? And the reason is because you need many types of biological genetic data to solve the puzzle, to solve the biological puzzle. So on the one hand, you need to understand the full diversity of natural sequences of the pathogen, and you need to understand how closely related organisms, as well as more distantly related organisms, would or would not be affected by this vaccine. Because you don't want a vaccine that's too broad, you don't want one that's too narrow or too specific. And then you have to also say, okay, what is the target of the vaccine? In this case, it's the spike protein. And then you might want to think, I don't want something that looks too much like human or other animal DSI or proteins that might cause, for example, autoimmune reactions or over-trigger the immune system. And then once I kind of have a good candidate design, then I get to this artificial sequence that is basically the conglomeration of all of that knowledge. And I start to do things like create phosphate bridges with biochemistry to make sure that it's a stable molecule that can be frozen without falling apart or be transported. And that's where a lot of special chemistry comes into play. And again, more biological data is needed to design those features. And that's why we have over 250 sequences, for example, listed in this patent. So to come back to my questions, the pandemic causing pathogen itself was not listed in the patent. There were other PABS DSI listed. They might or might not be. Was non-PABS DSI used? Probably in almost all cases that will be true. And how much of it? Lots. And the third topic that I wanted to cover, Adam, I hope I'm in time, despite the technological hiccups, was what I call the CBD olive branch to other ABS instruments. So Kirsty and Charlotte already introduced them to you, but I'm calling them the olive branch, or how the CBD is sending a message to other ABS instruments. And that's really here in para 27, mutually supportive of and adaptive to other international access and benefit sharing instruments, to avoid the stacking of obligations, to streamline process, invited to collaborate. So you can see the language is quite clear of this sort of olive branch gesture. And the reason for that is that if you're a virologist, for example, you don't only study highly pathogenic viruses, viruses that have the potential to cause a pathogen. You will touch and you will use in the course of your research DSI from all 4 UN4 that are making rules on DSI. And we also know at the same time that when PABS like DSI is used, that many of those patents, in fact, 98% of them, are for patents that are categorized as vaccines, diagnostics, or therapeutics, or some or all of the above. Meaning that the targets in the language right now, VDT, is actually really good, though that is the sort of the commercial focus of the use of PABS DSI. But almost all of those patents also cite or list CBD-like DSI, which is to say maybe a PABS instrument that really focuses on the sharing of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics is the most important outcome, whereas the additional monetary benefit sharing under PABS, because most of those commercial outcomes will also require the use of CBD DSI. Here, there might be room or an interest in a joint benefit sharing instrument for the collection of monetary benefits. And with that, I would love to thank the funders and of course the organizers, as well as, I lost my picture slide, as well as all of the colleagues around the world that I get to work with. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. So I really appreciated the way you illustrated the complexity of the topic from the scientific perspective, the ecosystem of databases, and how you illustrated it with some analogies as well, allegories. And we've heard about no man being an island and the olive branches. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Bart van Voren, who will speak whether the same holds true for the legal complexity and the legal regimes that govern the issue. Bart, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. And you can see my slides? Wonderful. So my name is Bart. I'm a lawyer at Covington & Burling. Covington is a law firm, a global law firm that is specialized in life sciences. So among others, pharmaceutical companies. We advise many of the world's pharmaceutical companies. Within our life sciences team, I have worked on access and benefit sharing since before the Nagoya Protocol entered into force, so more than 12 years now. I'll be giving you a private sector perspective to access and benefit sharing and how the DSI multilateral mechanism and PABs combine from a pharmaceutical company perspective. But note, I speak in my own name and not on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry in this specific instance. So I'll be sharing my own views. This is a little bit what Adam asked me to focus on. What are the risks in the current emerging system for DSI benefit sharing? What could the added value be of PABs? What are the linkages between the two instruments? How can we reduce transaction costs? And what would be my key message for the diplomats at INB 13? So I'll run through that now. So here is the perspective that I want to give you. So Amber gave a really wonderful presentation on how a single patent includes 250 sequences that are both PABs relevant, so pathogen access and benefit sharing, or that are CBD relevant. And that is really an excellent starting point, because from a company perspective, that results in what I call the stacking of access and benefit sharing obligations. So when a pharmaceutical company engages in R&D that typically encompasses more than 10 years of millions and millions of investment, pharmaceutical companies integrate very much into their decision-making process issues of legal and regulatory compliance. So pharmaceutical companies are some of the most regulated industries in the world. As you know, there will be no therapeutic or vaccine on the market without prior authorization by a government. So this need for legal compliance is really integrated into companies. So when they look at access and benefit sharing, here's what they see. You have the Nagoya Protocol that's now been in force, celebrated its 10th anniversary last October, and which has resulted in more than 100 national access and benefit sharing regimes in 142 parties to the Nagoya Protocol. Now, Kirsty mentioned earlier that the Nagoya Protocol focuses on physical genetic resources. Now, by our last count, national access and benefit sharing laws, at least 39 also directly or indirectly apply to digital sequence information already. So that in itself is an enormously complicated ecosystem of laws that apply to R&D on genetic resources. Come on top of that, now we have the global multilateral mechanism on benefit sharing with DSI that is not legally binding. It exists only at global level. But even then it says this global fund is without prejudice to national access and benefit sharing measures, and countries are, quote unquote, invited to align their national rules. They don't have to, they are invited to do so. So you start having a layered cake, physical, digital under Nagoya, you have now the CBD coming on top. And now you also have the World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty, pathogen access and benefit sharing being negotiated. Treaty hopefully finalized by May. That may apply to pathogens of pandemic potential as well as data. So you have already potentially 3 layers of access and benefit sharing regimes just at the international level, and then various national implementations that you have to navigate as a company. Now, Amber's example was really, you've seen the list of countries. I immediately could see already a couple of ABS laws that would have been triggered by just that patent. Now, I personally have worked on VTD, so vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, where the R&D triggered more than 50 ABS laws just for one single product. So all these laws, and they would also, now that we have the multilateral mechanism, trigger the multilateral mechanism. And once there would be a PABS, that same product would also trigger PABS. Now, from a company perspective, a nice sentence that these instruments should be mutually supportive is not sufficient. Why? Because you try to comply with all access and benefit sharing rules. But for instance, in the European Union, UK, Switzerland, Japan, Korea, you have to demonstrate compliance with all these access and benefit sharing laws. We have the EU regulation from 2014 requiring to demonstrate compliance with Nagoya. We have in the EU the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that requires companies likely to demonstrate compliance with Nagoya and CBD and its national implementing laws, with fines that are no less than potentially 5% of global turnover, with standing to litigate. So very high risk from a company perspective if you do not comply, as well as with the new WIPO treaty obligatory disclosure requirements. So all that taken together creates an extremely complicated legal system, a spaghetti ball of legal requirements with significant potential for sanctions. And honestly, it is a very challenging environment for companies to work in, to the point that the transaction cost, the compliance cost, is so high that R&D will follow the path of least resistance. Apologies. And I will not go too deeply into this, but in 2023, we did publish this report on how the Nagoya Protocol has already had negative impact on pathogen sharing. That was mostly physical samples, but there have been also examples, for instance, in Japanese encephalitis, where simply sharing a sequence was obstructed by the existence of national ABS law. So the impact is really there. Now, a point that I want to drive home is it is not that companies do not want to share benefits. It is not that companies are somehow against global equity, but the administrative and legal complexity that is created by the mushrooming of access and benefit sharing laws, rules, policies at international and national level is extraordinarily complicated and impossible to navigate. You cannot reasonably ask a company to comply with more than 50 different ABS laws or requirements. So how can PABS resolve this? And that's what I mean there. Show the world how it's done. Now, what you see there private sector needs is an attempt to make tangible what a functioning global ABS system should look like. Now, you've heard, no doubt, companies speak about legal certainty. What does legal certainty mean? That you must avoid even the possibility, and that's important, of multiple ABS requirements applying to the same pathogen, so the sample, the sequence, the product, or the R&D activity. One single regime. And to give you a concrete example, the CBD multilateral mechanism didn't actually define what is DSI, whereas the Pandemic Preparedness Influenza framework does have a definition of genetic sequence data, GSD. In addition to that, there is no definition of DSI under the multilateral mechanism, but it also says that it actually only applies to compliant DSI, so DSI that has been uploaded in compliance with national access and benefit sharing laws, and that is public. So by doing that, you create a distinction between public and private data, which is something that as a company you would need to verify and decide which is which. And second, you would need to check, has that data been uploaded in compliance with ABS laws? Brings you to the Nagoya Protocol, brings you to more than 100 ABS laws. And that honestly is enough to kill the global mechanism. You cannot as a company say, for this information specifically, I will pay 1% of my profits, but then I know that I might still need to comply with 100 other ABS laws. That is simply not reasonable. So you must exclude the possibility of multiple ABS requirements applying. look at the pathogen access and benefit sharing system. When would it apply? Which pathogens would it apply to? Which DSI would it apply to? Would it only apply once a pandemic is declared, meaning that perhaps may at some point, hopefully never it will apply, but in case of a pandemic, but meaning that if there's no pandemic, the DSI mechanism would apply, or the national. So even the fact that that is a question that is unresolved creates legal uncertainty and creates a problem from compliance. The second question that companies have is, if I give you millions, will this actually contribute to global equity? Or will it end up paying administrative fees, consultant fees, lawyer fees? Or will there be actually a public health impact or a biodiversity impact? I don't think there has ever been done an impact assessment of the contribution of the Nagoya Protocol to access to fair and equitable benefit sharing. But from my personal experience, and this is only anecdotal, I think that there have been far more costs in transaction costs paying lawyers than actually has been paid to biodiversity. So the question is, will PABS or will the DSI mechanism do better? Simplicity is essential. I see Adam on, so I will wrap up. Simplicity, one-stop shop. And the DSI mechanism says that it may actually that you may also pay to national authorities. So who will be giving you the certificate? Predictability, you must know for your entire research and development process what will be your obligations. You should also know not all companies are alike. Some are large, some are small, some cannot manufacture, some have R&D capacity. And if I may, a final point, a real opportunity to have the needs of the private sector heard is absolutely essential. In my view, it is unreasonable to have only 2 observer seats on the steering committee of the multilateral mechanism, whereas you list 7 sectors that will be in scope. There are far more voting seats for the indigenous peoples and local communities, which is entirely valid, but it does not make sense to have taxation without representation. Now, in my final slide, which I'll just present, I make a proposal how PABS could learn from existing ABS laws that function well. I'm happy to talk about that later, but I will wrap up now, because otherwise Adam will probably shut my microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. A very important presentation from the legal perspective. You know, as international lawyers, we often ask ourselves these questions about the complexity and harmonization of different regimes. And I think they will be crucial also in the ongoing context of ongoing negotiations. And now, without any further ado, I wanted to give the floor to Dr. Viviane Mulos-Teres, who's going to present the equity perspective on these discussions at CBD, WHO. And also, before I do that, I just wanted to mention to the participants, please start putting your questions in the chat. I already saw some questions that I noted down, but this way we can have proceed smoothly to the Q&A. Thank you. And Viviana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'll start noting that since we have participants, some that know more of the issue and the technicalities than others, just on a big picture again of where we are, which was a discussion about that when we have digital information from genetic resources that includes from plants and animals and microbes, and this excludes those that are from human nature, there was a debate about, do we have a legal system that is covering this from the perspective of the conventional biological diversity, which clearly does have those regulations with regards to genetic resources. But the question was, for the digital information from these genetic resources, is this covered by the same regime? So I think the first thing to note from this decision was it had already been agreed that yes, the regime should cover digital information from genetic resources, and that the basis should be the same deal for fairness that the conventional biological diversity and the Nagoya Protocol has, which is the principle that we are linking conservation of biodiversity with sustainable use and benefit sharing. So that was a general agreement, and that is on the factual agreement. At the same time, then, there was the specificity of how do we deal with the particular nature of digital information. Genetic resources that are not digital information. So there are other aspects, what we can call the difference being whether it's dematerialized. This is where we were just asking, should the regime be extended? But we are not questioning the existence of the regime per se for genetic resources as a whole, including for derivatives. Now, what we were seeking then was, what is a fair deal with regards to digital information? Should it apply? The answer was yes. And the issue is, how do we take into account the different nature being digital information, so natural information? How do we take into account those aspects to see how do we actually implement this in a way that it can be operationalized? So one of the important issues here is when we consider the equity question, which is what I was asked to talk about, is we need to step back and say, what has been the overall equity or fair deal on this implementation overall for genetic resources? So one of the contradictions of ironies of the system is that while there are constant activities in terms of pressure and destruction of biodiversity and acceleration of climate change, the spread of pathogens from animals and humans and in the environment, we are seeking at the same time to solve these problems by also saying, well, we need more innovation and more profits and growth, and then we need to redistribute back these profits to pay for the harms that we are causing biodiversity, to pay for the harms to indigenous peoples and local communities, and to try to give more equity back to countries where these resources come from. So we do have those contradictions. We should also be talking about how do we stop the harmful activities that are also being done, including, for example, the continuous subsidies that we have that are harmful to the environment, other forms of regulation that need to be implemented, beyond also discussing the aspect of redistributing some profits. The other important aspect is really about, what about sharing technology and sharing knowledge? And this is something where there has been there was an expectation within the CBD and Nagoya Protocol that it should be part of a fair deal, and we are not addressing this as significantly as it should be. And so when you hear, for example, one industry perspective to say, well, R&D will go wherever it's the easiest, well, this is then a race to the bottom. Is that what we really want? We want minimum regulation? Do we want minimum access to technology and knowledge just because we say we're going to get some very small percentage of profit? So that is not really going to be the fair deal for biodiversity. Second, we have to note that when we look at biodiversity financing, we have a bigger issue, a bigger problem where we're seeing there isn't sufficient financing for biodiversity. So this is going to be, we're trying to find some drops in the water through the Kali Fund for something very specific, which only applies to digital information of genetic resources, which is not covered under mutually agreed terms by domestic legislation, and that is made publicly available. So this is the scope that is specified under Annex 1, and this requires national legislation for implementation. So let's not think that this is, a very huge decision. It's still a work in progress. It is very important that the principle of fair and equitable sharing of benefits, which should not be just profit, but other non-monetary, which should be including sharing of technology, sharing of knowledge, that should be part of what we should strive to. But whether we get to that system or not, it still will take more implementation. And while it's a step forward in including DSI, we're still far from the kind of holistic solutions that we need. So of course, there will be need to be very much involved in this work in progress, providing comments on further modalities, for example, and remembering that this requires national implementation. And if not, countries can decide that this is within their scope of their national access and benefit sharing regime. Now, second point I'd highlight on the overall equity question, again, is that we're assuming that this sharing of early stage input, natural resources, as well as the digital information, that this should generally always be positive, and that more openness and more sharing will, be positive in general, not just for research, but for commercial products and overall for biodiversity. Now, that even if we assume that that is generally the case, we are not questioning why are we allowing to lock off this data further down when we're moving more downstream. So for example, in relation to intellectual property, it's been very difficult to discuss how do we also see the issue of regulating, for example, whether or not patents and other forms of intellectual property should be able to be taken out of genetic sequences, and then further on commercial products, whether there should also be a fair sharing then, if this is allowed to revert back to the system. And we do have examples there, for example, of the FAO plant treaty, where clearly it said, intellectual property should not be taken out of the materials as shared. And then subsequently, if there is intellectual property over materials that are developed, then those benefits, monetary benefits from that should also be shared back to the system. And we see also that with those elements, the system has not been functioning or providing the amount of benefits that were expected. So while there might be, we hear some industry players say, well, there's so much ABS already obligations, it's so much. At the same time, there is very little actual ABS projects where we can say, this is functioning very well and there's significant compliance. And this is because there's so many gaps in the system itself. So how do we actually regulate ABS is a very important issue, and in particular, how much flexibility from the national level is taken of how the ABS system is applied. But so with that, I'd just like to highlight again, the point is there is existing national ABS legislation that everyone should comply with, and DSI is just an additional element that's being introduced as to how do we apply this general principle in a way that is operationable to the particular nature of digital information. Now, so where are we now with the CBD decision? One important point is that the contributions that are to be made by the industry sectors to the fund are voluntary, and it will require for countries to establish a process for how to actually provide for the companies to provide these resources, and then how will those resources be shared by the fund itself is still to be developed. There was the general establishment of a small percentage of profit or revenues. This has to be determined how that will be done. But one element that we think needs to be developed further is this distinction between what are commercial or non-commercial activities. So the industrial sectors were identified, and then there are some particular carve-outs for public research or for academic institutions. So understanding when there are, let's say, non-commercial uses, but the focus should be on the type of use that is being made and not what is the kind of entity. So I'll just take an example from the Kew Royal Botanical Gardens Institute in London. And they, for example, in their policy updated June 2024, note how they comply with national access and benefit sharing legislations. And they mentioned that there can be, though their nature is nonprofit, there can be commercial use of genetic resources, which could include of DSI. And then they agree that from time to time, if they do take any kind of project with a commercial organization or whether themselves are doing any use that could be, they define commercialization as to apply, obtain, or transfer intellectual property rights or other tangible or intangible rights by sale or license in any other manner, commencement of product development, conducting market research, or seeking pre-market approval and or the sale of any resulting product. So I think this is a good way to understand that what we are trying to target is if there is a non-commercial use, we can have a different distinction than when there is a commercial use, but the type of entity might lead to very significant gaps, which in this example, for example, of Kew Gardens clearly shows that we should focus is on what is the type of use. When we're going to have a commercial use, then it should be subject then to this. And the second point is to mention why we should be focusing on whether there is intellectual property or not that is being obtained from the sharing of these materials. And that is because we are then blocking that general availability to the public that we would like to have of these same resources. So why is it that we are okay with creating all this additional policy responses, which mean a lot of transaction costs and a lot of additional costs for the consumers and for governments that follow on, but we're saying that that is okay because we want to promote innovation. But when we're saying that we want to protect biodiversity, recognize the different contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities, we're actually saying, well, that is in a way less valuable So we will only focus on ensuring that this is accessible and will make payments at the end for that general openness, but we won't do sharing of technology and know-how. So that's a significant gap that we need to close, both whether we're talking about in the biodiversity aspect or we're looking at what we do in the area of public health. The other point that I'd like to mention is on the relationship with other instruments that several of the other speakers have already added. I think again, let's be reminded of the specific scope that is covered under the instrument. And there is no,
just sorry to interrupt. Could you wrap up in a minute?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
This is my on the final point on the relationship with other instruments. I worry when I hear issues about not stacking of obligations, and particularly from the Convention of Biological Diversity, where we need really a good factual reading of where negotiations are, because these are sensitive issues and we're still in negotiation process. So when the CBD is taking a decision, it is within the CBD COP, and then we can of course draw implications and learnings for other processes, but these are independent. So for the PAB system, I think one of the general important points of equity is that we're talking about access to life-saving technologies. We're not talking about access to revenues of potential commercial products. And we're talking about particular significant inequities here. So it's I think one of the important elements of why we should in any case see that these are not directly linked to say that we can have a PAB solution that would apply to any other aspect. I'll stop there, but I hope we'll have more time for discussing additional points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Viviana. This was a very important perspective that will have to be kept in mind during ongoing negotiations as well. And I actually wanted to follow up. I won't let you catch breath, but follow up on some of the questions that have been raised already in the chat during your presentation. So Oscar Lizarazo asks about the CBD decision actually being a step backwards on intellectual property references, the facilitated access to IP as a means of technology transfer, capacity building, while contrasting it with other instruments in the field, such as CBD, the articles on technology transfer under the CBD and Nagoya Protocol. And also trying to kind of reframe the debate. We talked a lot about transaction costs under different regimes, but what if we talk about the transaction costs of intellectual property itself being this monopolizing force under international law? And one also question, and please feel free to address how much you would like, but it's from Tiana Nielsen about the distinction between this non-commercial versus commercial use and how this could be reflected in PAB's instrument. So if you're able to address that in 2 minutes, that would be very appreciated, and then we can move on to further discussions. Thank you. So Viviana, this was
I think that's for Viviana.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Adam, could you repeat the question? I
yes,
didn't realize
so sorry to follow up directly, but basically kind of reframing the debate and what you mentioned already, and I know you wrote about intellectual property references and all the lack of them in the ongoing CBD process. And Oscar Lizarazo asked about the decision being actually a step back on the references to technology transfer, capacity building, as compared with CBD or the Nagoya Protocol. So is it a step backwards from your perspective? And then Tiana Nielsen asked about this distinction between commercial and non-commercial use and how this could be embedded within PABs. So if you could give us your opinions.
Yeah, thank you. So on intellectual property, I mean, I'm comparing the CBD Nagoya current obligation versus the DSI. I mean, you'd have to see what is the scope of where governments, how will they decide to implement the DSI approach vis-a-vis what they would do more broadly for from access to genetic resources. There is always a possibility when they are requiring mutually agreed terms for DSI associated when there's direct access to genetic resources to include as non-monetary benefit sharing, for example, those aspects with regard to intellectual property. And then also countries can have their own intellectual property legislation, basically to limit, for example, whether there can be forms of intellectual property over, let's say, DNA sequences and so forth. So there is ample scope, I think, still for regulating. The point I was mentioning was in terms of the benefit sharing, in particular monetary, we are not touching upon in the discussion about sharing any benefits that are acquired, for example, either in sales of intellectual property or of licenses that are granted in the form of royalties that companies also get. So should that be part, for example, when we look at what are percentage of revenues? Well, in many countries, well, revenue is defined to include any royalties that they receive as well. So should that also be part of what should they pay in is the question. But at the same time, I caution that we should not overly rely on this profit perspective as a solution. And then just on the issue about commercialization, that's a really good point. And I think this has been discussed substantially overall in CBD and Nagoya Protocol implementation of how the agreements are reached. And for example, what you need in PABs is in any case, if there is an access, because in PABs, we're not talking about just DSI, right? We're talking about what is the regime for access to genetic material overall. So DSI is just one particular element. So here we have to be cautious that already the general framework that we have, the legal framework that would apply unless we do any particular carve out. And so what we would want to ensure is that there is a way to ensure that there is some contract that could be mutually, so MAT like we have in other regimes, and that the MAT would specify that if the change of purpose, so for example, as I gave with the example of the Kew Gardens, if you're doing a non-commercial activity, but then you do see some commercial potential, that you will have to renegotiate those terms in order for it to apply to you. So it's not based on the entity, but based on the use.
Thank you very much. And Amber, I know you wanted to weigh in on these, and let me even make it more complex by referring these questions, linking them to other questions that appeared on the chat in the meantime. So Oscar Lizarazo asked about INSDC being a publicly accessible system, but also including, but also based on material that can be subject to patent and applications and IP restrictions. So definitely wanted to connect it with the discussion about IP. And Tim Hirsch asked about the possibility of also of private companies when navigating this complex landscape, switching to their private databases, the proprietary databases that they may have. So if you've seen this in your practice, thank you.
Sure, that's like a number of different points, but I'll jump without trying to speak too quickly. So just a comment on the non-commercial users, and I fully agree with Viviana. I mean, there's no question that academic institutions, non-commercial users, can move things towards commercialization. What's the big difference though? In the vast majority of cases, it's their tax status. So I work at a collection and, you know, my boss has a patent, only one patent in 40 years, but hey, he had a lot of things going on. If he has a patent that is licensed by a company, somebody wants to try to make money with it, then any money that would result from that would have to go back into my institute's core budget and be in line with our non-profit status. So we can't, and that in our case basically means providing research infrastructure, research training, et cetera. And so we can't take that money and do something with it. And so the approach that the CBD is taking is actually makes a lot of sense. It basically says if you have a commercial activity, meaning you're having a for-profit activity, you're passing money on to your shareholders. Don't only pass money on to your shareholders, pass it back on to the countries of origin, right? I mean, so we have half of this floor that I'm working on is filled with visiting scientists, you know, from a number of countries around the world. And that's where any outcomes of commercialization heading activities would happen. And of course, they happen at a much lower frequency than in a for-profit entity. Brazil, during the CBD negotiations, said, we're going after the big fish. And they really focused on making sure that large multinational companies should pay first. And they left it as an open question whether or not for-profit, medium, and small companies should even pay. They don't pay right now under the current decision. Those are the things that you should address next. And if you want to come after academia in the fourth category, then that's an argument that should continue to be had. On IP in general, the reason that the CBD didn't make rules on IP is because it doesn't have the legal authority or remit. None of the environmental negotiators that were there could have made WIPO rules. It's not our job. However, the patent system is an open access system. It's full disclosure. I tell you my secrets, and then I receive protection from the state that I can use them. The great thing about that is that that open access data might be really useful for many different ABS instruments as a type of monitoring or ground truthing, a litmus test. Is this an entity that looks and smells like they are directly benefiting from DSI? I think that that data is certainly available there as a complementary monitoring tool. In terms of the relationships with other instruments, the amazing thing about the CBD, despite the emphasis in many people's heads with the, medicine man in the jungle finding the flower that has the cure for cancer, actually the CBD has no limits. It's not just animals and plants. It's everything, including pathogens. And that's what's going to trip up the intersection between PABs. That's Gustavo's comment on the thing. It is inevitable if the PABs scope is only roughly 20 viruses that have the potential, 20 viruses and 2 bacteria that have the potential to cause pandemics, then all the other 300 pathogens are in the scope of CBD by default. And so then, yes, you're going to have to work together in my scientific assessment. And in terms of the INSCC, I think my answers to Oscar and Tim are in the chat. I hope that will suffice. But the important note is that the CBD decision does make clear that any databases or any artificial intelligence tools that make money from the public data set also would have to pay. So if you had a private database close up its shop, then if it took the data from the public databases, it would also have to pay if it meets those thresholds.
Thank you, Amber. And just to mention, our panelists have been working tirelessly on the chat, answering questions. And yes, we will share the chat. So there is a wealth of material there, and we would probably need a much longer meeting to discuss all of it together. But let me now switch to the last round of questions. So firstly, for Charlotte, in 2 minutes, if you could respond to the questions from Claudia Price about whether there is a task force that explores the way of how to have corporate companies opting into the Kali Fund, and what do the companies get in return for their contributions and engagement with the Kali Fund? Question from Januka Burch.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. So I think it will also answer maybe some of the points that previous speakers have made or talked about. But so the Kali Fund will be open. There'll be a public notification on the CBD website. You can find them as well, and you can subscribe to them. And it will be hosted by the Multi-Partner Trust Fund, which is a UN body. So this is a UN fund. And basically, there's going to be a process for companies. It's very quick. It's incredibly transparent. This is why the parties have opted for this host for the fund, and opting into the Kali Fund and paying the sharing of the benefits as per Decision 16.2 gives you a certificate, which according to sorry, I was looking at the exact paragraph 15, excludes the user from any expectation to share further monetary benefits from the use of that DSI for that year. So I know that COP decisions are not legally binding, and this is a line we hear again and again and again. It doesn't mean it's meaningless in a court of law. Parties are parties to the CBD, and they have decided on this decision. We have a consensus-based decision process. So every single party has agreed to this decision. And they have agreed that the certificate excludes the user from having to share additional monetary benefits for that use. So this is what parties get. I also understand some frustration around the Nagoya Protocol, which is a bilateral mechanism. And this is why the DSI decision, the DSI discussions started under the CBD to not just include it in the Nagoya Protocol and have more bilateral obligations. There is also a review process, which is going to happen every 4 years. And there's a list of criteria that the very first review of the mechanism should look at. And that includes the potential inclusion of genetic resources into the multilateral mechanism on a voluntary basis for parties. So this is definitely an ongoing discussion. And the avoidance of the stacking of obligation is at the heart of all the decisions we take. So this is not just another thing we're piling on and telling companies just deal with it and that's it. So I'll stop here. I think you have other.
Thank you, Charlotte.
I hope it answered some of the concerns. Thank you.
Yes, and I also saw in the chat you made reference to other CBD instruments and decisions, so that will be helpful for the audience. And I will now give the floor to Bart to discuss in his perspective, how to avoid double payments and the legal, does he see it as possible to carve out pathogens, specific groups of pathogens, and what is his opinion about the timeline and the follow-up on the Kali Fund? And Bart, if in 2 minutes you can address these questions, and then we will close the webinar.
Happy to chat. I was looking in the chat as well, and Nitin made the very valid observation that the certificate that users will receive is only applicable to that DSI that is within the scope of the CBD MLM for that year. And that is exactly the problem. We don't know what that means. What DSI does that apply to? So from my perspective, to make the multilateral mechanism successful, it should go far beyond this notion of no expectations. What does that even mean? In legal terms, no expectation doesn't mean anything. The fact that it could be in a court of law, well, even mentioning that this would come up in the interpretation of a court of law would already scare a company, because why would you need to get to litigation in order to have legal clarity? That's not a proper way to regulate. So from my perspective, the multilateral mechanism should cover any DSI, no carve-outs, no compliance, and should, if you pay, that certificate should, in all 196 particles of the CBD, in law, be recognized, not no expectations, but as compliance with any applicable ABS laws. That's the only way that this regime can work, in my view.
Charlotte, do you have an immediate response to
Yeah,
that?
just a little thing. So I know that the scope of DSI and the mechanism is a very complex paragraph, and we are developing a guide sort of thing for various audiences to be able to look, not interpret, but look at the decision and read it. But we don't, as a secretariat, we don't interpret decisions. That's not our role. Also, in terms of, you know, one of the issues with private databases is that there are a lot of contractual agreements between, you know, the provider of the DSI from some specific database that they have populated themselves, that has never seen public, you know, sharing in the past, and some users, and there is no legal way for the CBD, and I believe probably not for the WHO either, to be able to interfere with those contractual arrangements. So in that sense, we can't just have sort of blanket decisions that englobe things that are not in our legal framework. So just to answer, it is not a simple thing, but I agree, for companies it would be really ideal to come to a decision like this eventually in time. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for this clarification also for our audience. And Bart, if you would like to add a few sentences on POPs from your perspective, how it should relate, if there should be a carve out for pathogens, and then with a little delay, but I will close the webinar. So since we still have some people online, if you have anything to add on POPs.
From my perspective, I think PABs would essentially require a list of pathogens or groups, at least of viral families that are covered in scope. That is the simplest, most straightforward way, and to make sure that it applies to those families, and that can be done by a scientific committee set up under the Pandemic Treaty. That's the most straightforward way to guarantee legal certainty.
Thank you. Thank you. So we've heard a variety of legal perspectives, probably ideas for follow-up events and discussions that should continue. And our idea here was really to make a bridge between the different processes and also highlight some of the complexities involved in them. So this brings us to the end of the webinar. And I wanted to thank all the speakers who have tirelessly prepared, answered questions on the chat. You know where to find them, and your interventions were very appreciated and bring, I think, a very fresh understanding to this topic. So we hope it was helpful and it creates foundations for further interactions. And in closing, let me also thank the team of the Global Health Center who helped organize this webinar. Eva Greenup, Bettina Zago, Erika Pinabargar, who have been working tirelessly to make it happen and to allow us to speak to you today. So it was great to see you today, and I hope for some follow-up discussions. And the materials and follow-ups will be communicated through chat, and you will find us at our email address. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Bye.
very much.